And yeah, let me hit the. Oops, I just hit the wrong button. Hold on. All right. There he is. The man, the myth, the legend. It's Aaron Simmons. And we are about to have ourselves some fun.
A good old time.
Yeah, a good
I want to make clear that your intro music makes me feel more than anything else I have experienced in almost 25 years. When I was a sophomore in college, I went to Cambridge for a study away, and we would go to these clubs, and they did what was called foam dancing. I don't know if you ever have tried this trip.
Foam dancing?
Foam dancing. So they would like imagine suds, but not wet. So it was like, you would just dance around almost like you were in this big washing machine with just this like foam everywhere, right?
Like
and you would dance,
balls?
it would fly up into the sky, and it was
like little foam balls.
No, like actual like soap suds, like foamy soap suds, but just dry, right? So it wasn't like wet. It was this chemical something that made all of these suds, right?
Okay.
But this was in the like heyday of like British house pop rave kind of music. And so we would go to these places, and the lights would be out and be just sort of flashing strobe lights with this soapy suds flying all over the world and, bumping into each other in the midst of all this foam.
Sounds like music. A slippery slope.
Well, the music sounds identical to what your intro music now, like the vibe it creates. I feel like I need to be in 1997 England dancing with the lights off to your intro music. So
dude,
I appreciate that.
The UK really enjoys bad dance music. And what's funny is the fact that a larger percentage of UK young adults enjoy dance music. It has not led to just as an island having better dancers. In my experience of going to dancing clubs with adults in Scotland, it's bad. It looks like the background of a video where the whole crowd that's in the background of like the film doesn't even know what song they're dancing to. They just have a click track, and they're like,
yes. Well, yes, Lori, with clothes, obviously in this case, but the thing that also your intro music makes me think of is it's kind of like when you're at some sort of, house dance party kind of thing, like, oh shoot, I don't even know, one of these like people who are musicians, but their first name is just DJ, and they, push buttons the whole night, right? And so you're waiting for the bass to drop, for like the beat to land. But in this case, there is no bass drop. It's just that then the music gives rise to your face. So I think that you have facilitated this so that your mug becomes the bass drop that the audience is excited about. Look, I think that's what's happening.
Aaron, I'll tell you, is they updated this program while I was traveling, and I haven't uploaded all my stuff back to it. And this is the third stream today, and the streaming keys got confused, and I had to start another song so I could put in the right streaming key, or all these people on Substack wouldn't be on our video. But I have the chat on Substack up, so nice. I'll see the questions there, because we learned last time those don't show up here.
Those don't come through.
We only see like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube.
I think we may see the YouTube ones coming in. Yeah. And great to see Jack, pronounced it, looking at his name and saying it wrong. Zach Jolly, one of my former students, one of the smartest humans I've ever worked with. Great to see him hopping in with us.
Students I've ever worked with.
This is true. And Lori, who has been rocking with us for all these live streams, awesome to see her back with us. And
she was on some of them earlier today.
My goodness.
This is Tripp's third live stream.
Wow.
Today. And both the others went over 2 hours. And so here's normal music for Zach.
There you go.
Oh yeah.
Are you familiar? Are you familiar with the Psych TV show that used to be on?
No.
Well, for anybody who is, the idea that Tripp does the best impression of Gus, late night Gus. If any of y'all are familiar with this, that's pretty fantastic. So I think we need to get a shirt with Tripp's face, and underneath it just says, "Oh yeah."
Oh yeah. So, you know what I used to say until all my youth started saying it back is I used to go, "Oh junk." And I don't even know why I started saying it.
I don't even know what that means.
It means, oh yeah, but like junk, like that's wild and crazy. And I used to come up with stuff similar to what the youth are saying, but it's like 1 or 2 deviations away to make it awkward. Or he says "true story," which is another phrase Tripp uses on a regular basis. And so I would say all junk, or the other thing they will all say back to me, if I ask them a question that's looking for specifics, like when are we doing this or what order are we doing this? Whenever they ask me those questions, I would always look at them with a face and go, at the appointed time.
Oh my goodness.
Or when the conditions arise.
What a nerd.
Like that. Mostly it's because I hate having a locked in plan, because when you're navigating like 60 teenagers, you got to read the room. You got to follow the spirit, even though you're mainline Protestant. And so like when they're like, so when are we playing games? I go at the appointed time, because there may be, everyone has all this pressure from what's going on at school and parents and stuff. And we basically just need to share something about our week. I'll tell them God loves them. And then we go crazy. Or you give a little prompt, someone starts sharing, someone else starts sharing. Now you've got 4 hours of just unending stuff, and it's not till the end of the lock-in you're doing anything fun. That's fine. So the point in time was always when I was telling, like, some portion of every time we get together, you got to lean into your young side, and another part you lean into the adult side. The ratio varies.
I love that. I think you've also just described my pedagogy. So what my students might call just unprepared is actually, I am so prepared that I can choose to make this go 17 different ways depending on what I'm getting from the audience, right? Or at least that's how I've chosen to narrate my version of preparation. So my aw junk would be a thing my students make fun of me for saying, which I didn't realize I was saying all that much, but I apparently, like, having explained something to them, I'll then say, so do you see the move? And what I am trying to say is, like, all of this is a kind of big logic game. And you see the move that just was made. That's freaking cool. But they thought it was like such a strange phrase that now I get mocked for seeing the move. Yeah.
Okay. So, for everyone that's already on here, Josh, when you're editing this is about the time you're going to start the edited version for the podcast. All right, I'm going to hit the air horn so you remember, and because Aaron needs some air horn in his life.
Always.
Oh, junk. Hello, everybody. This is Trip. This is a third live stream for the Democracy Intention Summit, which is an online gathering that's going to be a lot of fun. You say, whoa, it's the last one, but it's going to be a lot of fun. That's because we're just started. There's a host of lectures from different philosophers and theologians talking about the tension in our political, religious, and cultural system. And you can access all those at homebrewedclasses.com. Sign up. You'll get a link. You'll be able to watch all these lectures. And boom, some of them have been joining us for Q&A. One of our friends, Matt Segall, is going to be here in just a few minutes. And we're going to talk about process philosophy and political philosophy. And he gave a nice little lecture about some process engagement with Carl Schmitt. And I know Aaron Simmons likes to talk about Carl Schmitt. So I do like talking about him. I'm basically going to be trying to get Matt to witness to you on behalf of process while talking about democracy and stuff. But y'all sent in some really cool questions, and I put all of the process-related ones in our list for today.
I realized this. Tripp sends me the questions ahead of time, and he's like, all right, man, here's some possible ideas for how we can break this out. And again, as we were just discussing, your approach to youth pastor, my approach to philosophy professor, it's you kind of flow with what you're being given, right? And so we have this kind of general idea of where we might go. To my utter annoyance, wherever I look, section 1, section 4, section 3, process. So you have certainly skewed the discourse tonight, my dear friend. And I will do my best not to point out that this is a heavy-handed authoritarian notion of sovereignty trying to articulate a process model. But
okay. But before Matt gets here, he just got back from Europe, and who knows what time zone he's in. He's in California, but he's like, I can be awake and on at 6:30 my time. Because someone else in our summit was coming and they got a sick child, and I was like, you should not ignore them on a Friday night. But we're going to do follow-up interviews.
Podcast, right? Third podcast of the
we're
day.
Beginning my fifth hour of live streaming.
I've been through 3 states today and have spoken to a couple different audiences. So in the same way, this could either be feisty and engaging or utterly ridiculous. I'm hoping both.
Okay, just tell everyone Homebrewed Classes to go there, donate anything between $0 and $1 million. You can sign up and join. And then Aaron and I are going to do follow-up conversations with all these different speakers, including the questions people send. And by the way, a couple of you sent questions and you put the name of the person in the question you have for them. And great. Yeah. So those are all being organized. There are a few fun questions that I think would be ideal for us to discuss before Matt gets here. In David Miller asks, how about some phenomenology and Christian nationalism? What's Aaron got to say about that?
Phenomenology and Christian nationalism?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have lots of things to say about both. I'm trying to figure out what I have to say about them.
How a nation gives itself.
Yeah, that's an interesting
question.
What
is the epoche of nationalism?
What is the heuletic data of the Christian nationalist? So Josh Patterson and I are going to be doing a podcast over at Rethinking Faith fairly soon about kind of Phenomenology 101. What is it? Why does it matter? Why is it relevant to people interested in the kinds of things that are discussed on this God pod circle of online conversations? But for maybe this question, what I would say is phenomenology, I think in general, is super cool in that it is paying very, very careful attention. Good job, Zach. A very careful attention to the way things present themselves to our consciousness. And so in that sense, it's an analysis of our experience as first personal experience.
Yeah.
Now, that sounds super technical and weird. All I mean by that is instead of thinking about like objectifying discourse, what is the case about that object out there? Phenomenology says, well, whatever the case is about that object, what is the case about the way that that object presents itself to me as experienced, right? And so in that sense, that's where phenomenology shows up.
Yeah. So like an example that I think we've talked about before when talking is like a cup. Mm-hmm. This obviously is a Spider-Man related cup. So people watching it, they get obviously a rather flat rendering of the cup, but they've held cups before. They're like, oh, he's obviously drinking. It's Friday night. I wonder what's in it. Probably bourbon and Diet Dr. Pepper. And I bet the pattern continues and all that. But underneath that, you're now thinking of your own experience in 3D. Oh, the pattern, filling in the backside, and part of what you're getting at by distinguishing, like by just attending to what gives itself in the phenomena, is starting to set aside our habits of projection, interpretation, and context.
Yeah.
And, you say that, but, I just got to wonder, like, are you saying that when you read the New Testament and think about biblical Christianity, like, it doesn't just give itself as MAGA?
Well, so like, as you're saying that, part of what it makes me think is, what would we make of the phenomenon or the performance of what we call Christian nationalism if we didn't bring to the fore all of our theories and preconceptions of what Christian nationalism is?
Yeah.
Right. And that, I think, is a really fascinating question, because it might look very different if we said, well, shoot, here is a group of people so excited about what they take to be theologically the case that it is now playing out in their social lives to such a degree that they actively want these two things to overlap seamlessly, right? And in doing so, this model of commitment sure looks an awful lot like the kind of thing that we want to cultivate in other people, in our students, in our friends, that they actually live compellingly in light of the stuff they take to be true, right? So if we look at it without the preconceptions, without the theory, what Husserl would call the natural attitude, it's just there and obvious. If we say, well, what is it that we see? To then say, no, what I see is idolatry, which is a word we used a lot talking to Aaron Stelfer last time, right? But do I see idolatry? Or is it the case that what I see is humans very committed to some stuff, doing their best to try to get other people committed to this in ways that then create the society they envision as the most productive? Well, if that's what I take as confronting me, it turns out that that's actually maybe the goal, right? Maybe that's not as bad as we think. So I think one of the important ideas that we should think about when we talk about phenomenology, though, is the idea of how is it that we bring our ideas, our conceptions, our assumptions to bear on our encounters in the world. And that would be the thing, I think, that then there's nothing unique about Christian nationalism. It could be all kinds of stuff. And my philosopher's intuition is, if we do that, we start realizing that we on the right side of things probably look almost identical without the context that frames it that way. Like, I've been listening to this really cool podcast, Was I in a Cult? And as I listen to these things, I highly recommend it. It's great. But I've been listening to this as I drove to Georgia today to give a talk. I mean, this stuff's crazy and terrifying and awful. And yet then you think, yeah, but with just a few little tweaks, it sure sounds an awful lot like what I grew up in. Now, I did not grow up in a cultic community. I was given lots of freedom to think and wrestle. And so none of that is true. And yet, man, if I were looking at this without this context of, well, that's not true for me, how similar this might look, right? Yeah. And that's what we were talking about last time with like January 6th being idolatry or prophetic witness. Mm-hmm. Well, the phenomenon of a bunch of people storming the halls of power in the name of freedom and justice and their God Million Man March, January 6th. Like, of course they're different. One is virtuous and one is horrifying. And yet, phenomenologically, what is it that's being given in these moments allows us to think, how much interpretive structures are we providing, right? How much narration is already making it do work like that?
Okay, I'm just saying, and Brenda in the chat, one of her comments here around this is that God's character is somewhat recognizable, and this is where the theologians just really appreciate the concept of self-revelation. And I'm just saying, I know just because you're a Pentecostal and you're very postmodern, Aaron, and you're so postmodern, yeah, you might be uncomfortable with the notion of revelation, but if you were acting as if there was something particular about the divine revealed in the event of Jesus, you might make a certain judgment about militant Christian nationalism. But that's why Matt's here. You might,
though.
No, we're about to invite Matt on. I was just trolling you.
Well, but I'm wanting to make sure that people realize my Pentecostal self just wants to say amen. My philosopher self.
Stop. Don't talk to your philosopher,
my
Aaron.
philosopher self wants to say, but wait a minute. Maybe
this is why the
humanities is the opposite.
This is why the humanities are dying, as philosophers want clarity.
This is why we can't have nice things.
This is why we can't have nice things. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the stage or the stream. A guy and citizen, Matt Segall. What's up, Matt?
Hey, Trip. Hey, Aaron. Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Hey, nice to meet you too. Glad to have you with us.
Super excited to be here. Yeah.
Dude, I was just jealous watching all my process friends hang out in Europe, and
we missed you, Trip.
There
was a trip-sized hole, and we all felt it.
You did? Okay, good. I feel a little bit better about that. I know a number. I feel like all of y'all got to Europe right when I left, and
So I'm making a special request to everybody, in particular in the Democracy Intention Facebook group.
Oh,
the task for you is to finish the setup with the punchline. We all felt a trip-sized hole. I'm waiting for the punchline to that. So a shiny like from me on the Facebook group if you punchline that setup.
Oh God, I don't know.
Tried to Sorry, Trip. I that's my fault.
But Matt, what are you getting back from? I am not a process theologian, and so I don't pay attention to the things that you all get very excited about.
Well, the Center for Process Studies was just hosting a conference that was bringing process philosophy and plasma cosmology into dialogue.
Nice.
And there was a sort of UFOlogy angle to it, because the thing about plasma is a lot of people that encounter non-human intelligences, as they're called, seem to describe something like what a plasma physicist would recognize as a plasma phenomenon. So we had a wild and crazy, but really synergistic time.
Nice.
Very interdisciplinary, I'll say.
Oh, very cool. I hope as we dig into the pages after pages after pages of process questions that Tripp has received and thrown to the front of our discussion tonight, I hope we do get a chance to talk about the possible distinctions between process metaphysics or process philosophy on the one hand and process theology on the other, because I think that's a distinction not well enough discussed among the process theology crowd, and one that might be of interest.
Definitely.
Yeah. So just so Aaron is well, I guess was recent outgoing president of the Kierkegaard Society. Publishes a lot on like the French phenomenologist and that kind of thing. So you'll have like a reference point and such. Aaron, if you are looking at that list and want to put numbers of which questions you want me to throw up on the screen, I can do that, because people send in a bunch of them.
Yeah, those are really good questions.
But like one of the questions I didn't put on that list I thought might be helpful, Matt, for people just to get an idea of where you're coming from, is was asking how do you start when you start thinking as a process philosopher? what is like the engine or the instigator when they heard the way you're like engaged Schmitt? What in the world was that?
Oh, did that come through? Usually Zoom blocks that out. I live in downtown Oakland, and so
okay.
Just heard someone race by, and they're very loud and impressive automobile.
I was convinced that Tripp's pushing buttons. So
I thought it was one of those cues, like the other day I put my hands up like this and all of a sudden
fireworks like go off and stuff.
You're like, well, it has sound effects now.
But Zoom usually has been so good at blocking that stuff out. I didn't even think twice, but I will mute next time I hear something like
it's all good.
I thought it, I mean, do you notice though, if there's an argument for divine sovereignty and purposive metaphysics, the fact that you were just saying it's an engine and then the engine hit, I was like, man, Tripp is pushing buttons at that moment. So I'm still convinced that he was, and now he's trying to act like, oh, how mystical.
Divine timing.
I know. Yeah. Well,
so wait, what's the question, Tripp? What is
if God is dipolar? I wish everyone could dream about it. Oh,
there you go.
No. The question was, how does a process philosopher begin thinking about something that Whitehead doesn't spend a lot of time talking about, like
democracy?
Yeah.
Well, he doesn't have nothing to say about it. I'm sorry for the double negative, but he has a few things in Adventures of Ideas, and the whole idea of in Process and Reality, the democracy of fellow creatures that we live amidst. I think he's at least providing some suggestive hints, and he's a pluralist. Ontologically, he's a pluralist, but I think metaphysics and ontology is very important for doing politics. I think particularly in the Anthropocene, if we want to call it that, just as a popular marker of the fact that human beings are now the dominant force on the planet, like at a geochemical level, at a meteorological level. It's not that we control the weather. Well, some people think we do, but it's that we have an outsized influence on the future of this planet. And I think Whitehead gives us a lot of tools for thinking with and concepts to help us navigate that situation, which is at least partially political. In large part political, because even if we have a bunch of scientific knowledge that we think should be actionable, if we can't get politically organized around it, then we're screwed. And so I think in terms of digesting and understanding the science, understanding what complex causality is all about, feedback loops, and being immersed in this Earth system. The system is a bit too dry and abstract for it. This Earth organism, it's a living being, I think, and I think we need to relate to it in that way and orient our societies and as we try to navigate through a great deal of political turmoil, envision a type of future where we as human beings can expand our sense of society to include non-humans. And Whitehead uses this term society in a much more generic and all-encompassing way than we're used to apply to collectives of all shapes and sizes, from the cellular to the astronomical and galactic and so on. So I think there are a lot of ways that Whitehead can speak to the challenges of democracy and making worlds together, which is what politics is really about. So yeah, I mean, there's so many ways we could draw on his thought. I don't even know where to begin, but I think there are many.
Yeah. Okay, so you engaged Carl Schmitt in the lecture, and Aaron and I've talked about it before. So I thought what I'd do is get Aaron to kind of briefly say why people, of all the philosophers that have talked about politics, he's interesting and keeps showing up in conversation and stuff. And then I'll use questions people sent in response to your lecture to kind of,
cool,
for us to kind of go back and forth and play that out a bit. So Aaron, well, why do so many of our philosopher friends like talking about Carl Schmitt today?
Yeah, and so in general, if you don't know who Carl Schmitt is, the things that matter most is he is a political theorist writing explicitly in defense of National Socialism and the conception of the radical need for sovereignty and what he even calls dictatorship. And so German thinker in the midst of the National Socialist movement, why in the world would a bunch of democratic theorists draw on a Nazi political thinker, right? It's a really good question. The thing that tends to happen is in debates relative to democratic political thought, Schmitt is really, really important for two reasons. One, as Matt discusses in his lecture, is Schmitt points out one of the real deep tensions within liberal societies, which is part of the intuition of liberalism, which is a radical commitment to individual freedom and individual agency, is at odds with the basic commitment of democracy, which is popular sovereignty. So how is it that we can hold together radical freedom and popular sovereignty as mutual social goods when they actively are cutting against each other, right? So Schmitt illustrates, animates, and then discusses that tension. He lands as a radical anti-democrat in favor of the only way that you can actually have real freedom is ironically to have a very, very unilateral authoritarian sovereign who is deciding things. And that's ironically what makes some of the liberal project possible. Now, that sounds bizarre. And so that's why he's so interesting to a bunch of liberal political philosophers. The second reason, and I actually find this more interesting, but the first point about the need of sovereignty in order for liberalism to be possible, that I think is really relevant to what do we do with, as the title of this episode is about, Christianity in a Trump America, right? Well, it turns out, how then are we going to make sense of Trump as a threat to democracy if there might be some arguments that the threat to democracy is precisely in the name of the benefit to some of these liberal intuitions? And that sounds utterly bizarre, utterly strange. And Schmitt helps us think about what's at stake. But the second thing Schmitt does, which again is my real interest in Schmitt, is Schmitt basically suggests that any political model of a democratic society guided by a commitment to consensus is doomed to failure. That at the very root of what he will call, and people like Chantal Mouffe will develop, of the political, what the political is a space of radical friend-enemy tension, friend-enemy antagonism. And so what democratic thinkers do is they say, well, shoot, what if Schmitt's right? What if the goal of the political can't be to find some middle way consensus where we all get along at our process philosophy conference and sit around and sing songs, and at the end of it, we get really excited because Tripp comes in and fills the Tripp-shaped hole that we have in our hearts? What if the political requires what sometimes is referred to in the literature as dissensus, the continuation of disagreement as animating the political task itself, right? And that's where then contemporary political democratic theorists say, Schmitt points this out and Schmitt is right. But we don't have to follow Schmitt's answer. It doesn't mean the friend enemy is going to go all the way down. All we've got is a war of all against all. Bring in the sovereign to protect our safety. What we might have is a different radical notion of democracy. And this radical democracy, which Aaron Stauffer was defending in our last live stream, radical democracy is one that says, hey, the goal is not to come to final agreement. It's to transform enemies into interlocutors, to transform enemies into discursive conversational partners without the goal being to finally agree in light of capital R reason, but maybe actually to disagree as the animating performance of what democratic political life looks like. And so Schmitt gives us both of those things. What do we do with the idea of sovereignty and the tension between liberalism and democracy? And two, how do we reconceive the political as not some sort of let's all get together and find the ideal situation? Maybe it's about how do we manage the temptation to see enemies when we really should see agonistic opponents as propelling us into the kind of society that is really flourishing. So does that sound right, Matt? There's my 5-minute take on what took me about 4 weeks in a radical political theory seminar this spring.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of putting Carl Schmitt on the table. It's odd. It's even more odd than, say, having to justify studying Heidegger, because it's so much more in your face than Schmitt, like actually for several years being the one justifying Hitler's extrajudicial killings of people and all this stuff. So why study him? And I think you laid out the reasons that he's exposed the fragility of certain aspects of liberalism in its own attempt to justify itself. And when your enemy exposes your weak points, you do well to, and you've already got a historical example of it being very accurate. Best to pay attention.
And he's a smart dude. So I mean, when you read Schmitt, unlike some of the Schmittian appropriators, whether critical or positive, he's actually really readable, I think. I would much rather read political theology than read States of Exception by Agamben, even though States of Exception has a wonderful critique of Schmitt's notion of sovereignty and the defense of what we might call a radical kind of democratic project, I mean, of sorts. But my goodness, like half that book, I always find myself just thinking, okay, where next? But when I read Schmitt, every sentence is just so interesting and compelling. And so he proves the fact to all of us who write books. It is courageous, as John Caputo used to say of Merold Westphal, it is courageous to write in such a way that your critics can understand you. And so I do admire Schmitt on that front.
Well, there are many admirers of Agamben that are not exactly sure what 60 pages of the book they just finished were up to. Okay, so here's a question, Matt. There's a number of Schmitt related questions on what happened in the in your lecture, but Rachel's here is pretty broad, so I think you might be able to set things up for people that didn't follow that section of your talk, where she asks, what can we learn from Schmitt's critique of liberalism without embracing authoritarianism?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, it's not the bulk of his book on political theology, but when he talks about these neutralizations which have occurred over the course of the last several centuries of modernity, in the 20th, he talks about the technological neutralization, and the idea here would be that there was widespread agreement among communists and liberals and fascists that they thought of technology as being in some sense neutral, and especially liberals thought of technology as being in some sense value neutral. But it turns out each technology and media technology in particular, totally, as Marshall McLuhan would later point out in great detail, brilliant detail, totally reorganizes the human sensorium and transforms not just what we communicate, but how we communicate and the very nature of meaning. I mean, when you think about the effect that, say, the printing press had on the Protestant Reformation, people have that as a historical example to understand how technologies catalyze political and social and cultural revolutions. And so I think, Schmitt pointing out that technology is not neutral in the midst of the early 20th century, when there was the beginnings of what we now call this myth of technological progress, where things are just, I guess it started in the 19th century, but things are just going to get better and better and better. Everyone agreed on that. The communists agreed, right? The liberals agreed. And so that's clearly, I think, something we can learn from him. He was prescient, and others recognized it too, that we need to pay more attention to the ways in which we're constantly trying to find surrogates for politics. And it's, Schmitt's obviously not one who would want to reduce theology to politics. But at the same time, he's pointing out this transference of metaphor between politics and theology. And I think when we understand technology nowadays, there are also transference of metaphors. We're seeing in our time another example of how technology is not neutral, in the sense that these programmers and engineers in Silicon Valley and elsewhere are drawing on the occult and demonology and various theologies in order to understand these intelligent machines, that they're super intelligent machines that they're creating, even though they're not quite sure how they're creating them or how they work exactly anymore. And so the Frankenstein monster has escaped the laboratory, you know. And
well, that story works out well,
right? Yeah, no, and the loopy part of this is that all of these AI technologies have those very stories in them, and those stories, the science fiction we've created about them, is going to drive and shape the ways that they start behaving. And so, yeah, I think paying more attention to technology and its effects on culture and politics are important. And also for liberals in particular, I think we can learn from Schmitt that the values that liberal societies have upheld are not free of metaphysical and even a theological background. This idea of human rights, for example, you can't, and even John Rawls admits this, and he kind of he hides it in the footnotes. But he, you know, the most well-known political philosopher, liberal political philosopher of the 20th century, admits that the idea of human rights has real metaphysical ground in like a natural law tradition, and you can't just say that, oh no, human institutions create this idea and sustain this idea. It has to be rooted more deeply than that. And so, don't be afraid of metaphysics. I think in the ways that metaphysics and theology drive human behavior, even if you don't call it theology, but you think you've just become secular and now you worship football or you worship iPhones or whatever, there's still a theological substratum to human life, in the sense that we're forced to, we're all motivated by something ultimate that drives us to make decisions beyond just our own. I mean, there is a I guess a gospel of me where it is just you, but that's still a metaphysical choice that you're making about what's going to drive you. And I think we should, as if you're a defender of an idea like human rights, which I am, if you're a defender of an ideal like democracy, and individual freedom and social justice, which sometimes are in tension, but nonetheless, in an agonistic society, we can defend both of those, individual freedom and social justice. You need to be able to provide metaphysical justification for these ideas. You can't just pretend, you know, Schmitt really pulls the rug out from someone who would pretend that you can just have a merely procedural, definitional, legal defense of these ideas.
Yeah.
Right? Legal systems exist to defend and protect rights that weren't produced by the legal system. Governments exist, as we have enshrined in our Constitution, to protect rights that weren't created by the government, that weren't created by human institutions, right? And so I think Schmitt's inviting us to own up to that, and you don't have to go in a traditional God direction with that. There's a Buddhist way of doing this, you know, there's a Hindu way of doing this, but there's various indigenous ways of doing this, but we have to do it. We have to do metaphysics.
And what's fascinating about like all the ways different wisdom traditions do it, they do locate the reservoir of value beyond the horizon of the kind of neoliberal modern self. And I think that that's the, you know, like the resisting that Schmittian thing in part is not giving in to the ultimately the anthropology that's at the heart of the of his own kind of like Nazi related proposal.
Yeah.
It's also possible though to, you know, so the question says, you know, how can we appropriate his critique of liberalism without basically accepting his solution, right? He says, here's this critique, here's the way forward. I think one of the things we can say is the critique he offers fundamentally ignores the possibility of leaning harder into the democratic intuitions that might serve as correctives to these liberal excesses. And so this is effectively what agonistic democracy is all about. This is on some levels what democratic socialism is trying to do, right? Where socialism is not just an economic view, but a model of a more communitarian conception of how we understand the participants in the democratic process. And so I find Schmitt fascinating because I think he's probably right. about both of his big points, which is liberal society is way more efficient if we just give in to sovereignty, right? I mean, my goodness, anyone who's ever been to a faculty meeting or a board of directors meeting or, good God, like a PTA meeting, right? And you think to yourself, wow, maybe Plato was right. Just let, like, you know, the epistocratic regime take over. Those who know just answer this stuff. And so the reality of just the efficiency of sovereignty is something we should take really seriously, because especially like Matt's point, and Aaron talked about this as well, and several of the people we've been talking to have made these points, that if we are concerned with climate and the environment as basically like the moral challenge of the future of democracy, which I think there's good reasons to think it is, which is effectively how do we expand our political community to include non-traditional liberal entities, right? Well, the most efficient way to solve that problem is to be radically authoritarian and just make sure the leader is pro-climate, right? Like, that just solves the problem. But we lose in that all kinds of other goods. And that tension is the thing that I think Schmitt helps us understand. And that's why the second point, politics is fundamentally struggle, has to be taken seriously. It's not some sort of, you know, as much as I've been defending reason giving in all of our live streams and trying to say, hey, I get why you theologians keep wanting to run to kind of like these imaginative narratives that call us to be better selves. But at the end of the day, I've got to justify my view to somebody who thinks it's garbage. And reason giving is the hallmark of democratic deliberation. And there's something powerful about this. Rob Talise's lecture directly speaks to this. Dave Scott speaks to this in his lecture. But that means the goal is not agreement. Yeah. The goal is the right kind of deliberative process. And that's something that liberal societies, right? The open society, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of protest and critique. These are the institutional structures by which robust democratic disagreement can happen. Right. I mean, just today, Trump fired the, basically the economic statistics analysis person who basically says, hey, we had to revise back our, fiscal reporting because it wasn't as good as we thought. And he's like, all right, get rid of her. I don't like your data.
Yeah.
And you're like, well,
yeah, or right before Israel fell, the king exchanged prophets to get one that would say what they wanted.
I mean, like, you'll get the data you want. The problem is that doesn't come with really good, trust in the institutions, right? And so I think that you might say what Schmitt does is leaves on the table the possibility of being better at democracy as a way of trying to rethink what it means to be liberal. Schmitt just says, hey, if we're going to rethink what it means to be liberal, screw that democracy stuff. And I think that's the move that is fundamentally misguided. But it also helps us make sense of why so many people might be really excited within the Christian churches about pastors that are authoritarian, right? And within the political sphere of political leaders that are authoritarian. And let's be honest, about gods that are authoritarian, because that gets stuff done. Right. And so I think there's something we miss if we say, oh, well, his account of authoritarianism, we've got to reject that. I think we should, but without ignoring the reasons that so many might find that compelling in really, really interesting ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I can already tell that I should just group questions, show a bunch of them around a topic, and then just let y'all talk to each other. It'll be the more efficient to cover more topics. And the first point Matt made about kind of like learning from Schmitt was around how liberalism sees technology as value neutral, but actually technology generates a whole form of life, communicating, relating, what comes to the fore, what goes to the background. Like you mentioned McLuhan. I really feel like if we're going to learn that lesson, Jacques Ellul helps a lot better than plenty of others. But we had a couple questions about this, and I had to shorten like large emails. So I'm going to read both questions and then add a little prompting, and then you can say whatever you want, Matt. Okay. So Kevin said, Schmitt saw technology as a new anti-religion, enabling mass control. How do we navigate social media, algorithms, and AI? Which y'all shall know, like Matt lives and works right next to all the people that are making all these things in the Bay Area. So he might be tattletelling on his neighbors. Carlos asks, what's the difference between information and propaganda in our current media market or media landscape? And they both had larger things, and there were other stuff that showed up in messages people had about questions about, especially our current time, right? Like someone said, oh, well, democracy was formed when we debated with print and chose people to go argue face to face in person. And then you had mass media, right? Like TV, radio, that kind of thing. And now we're in this niche media where algorithms give everyone their own unique diet based on the worst version of themselves. And that's when Trump, the last 10 years, becomes dominant, right? And in neither TV as a primary medium or print could you imagine someone becoming president whose first famous thing is the first black president isn't a real citizen. But because and I think this was in Kevin's email, because all the people I know that got that in there were ready to listen to it. They saw it for 6 or 7 years, before everyone else, just sees more about it. And so, like, when you're thinking of Schmitt and the way his philosophy showed up, right, for the Nazis and pioneering new propaganda, new technology and such, and seeing, technology isn't value neutral. It both like orients how our ears are formed and creates whole new tactics, right, for relating to the mass. How do you see our like current moment if we're hoping to think about this whole web of life, even beyond our nation and including our non-human neighbors? How do we start to have a conversation where the incentive structure and algorithmic orientations don't like swamp us immediately, right? I think that anxiety thing you raised a bit in the lecture, and then there were long emails about it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I talked about was how part of the liberal project has been predicated upon the idea that an educated populace that's rational can be self-governing, and that through media, newspaper, predominantly in the days that the democracies that we know and love and that are failing now that came to exist, there was more of a capacity to self-regulate. There was plenty of propaganda, but people were literate, and we could have people had an attention span to pay attention to a 6-hour Lincoln Douglas debate or whatever, and really get into the issues. Hitler made very good use of the radio to produce that sort of mass mind and demagogic consensus in Germany. What's it called? The Doppelganger, I think, this radio that could fit into the living room of every German. And, it was used to great effect in the US too, in the anti-war movement, and then film also, of course. But radio does foster this sense of mind meld. Whereas television, it obviously has a number of effects as a medium, but it did allow for this sort of New World Order consensus, American consensus, to hold sway to the end of the Cold War, where CNN was a trusted news source internationally. Like, imagine the time. Obviously, there was a lot of narrative shaping and ignoring certain things that were going on, but there was a sense of consensus with mass media for a time. And social media, as everybody knows now, has completely upended that whole picture. And now everybody's a journalist, or nobody is a journalist. Facts are made up, quite obviously, just based on who the circles that you swim in and the different social media tribes that you belong to. And so social media fosters a kind of populism, and another kind of demagoguery like radio, but it's a little bit more unstable and chaotic. I think it's very hard. I mean, even the Trump coalition is quite rowdy, and there are different tribes within that some of them are beginning to peel off now. So it's really more of we're in like a neo-feudalism, I think, situation with social media, cryptocurrency, and AI. I think is going to play into that. And there are some aspects of feudalism in terms of, I'm not going to sit here and defend feudalism, but I think returning to something like the social ecologist sense of municipalism, and like returning to a place-based sense of politics. Not that we wouldn't federalize and have larger networks of mutuality, but returning to a sense that we need to localize and have some degree of local lawmaking power, and not wanting everything to be universalized. Maybe there are some things that should be having to do with human rights, for example, that we would want to defend at a more broad international, multi-local scale. But there's some aspects of this shift that social media and the internet is bringing about that could be positive, and that could be harnessed for a sort of situation where information is globally exchanged, but industrial and agricultural production are localized, right? And a lot of theorists have talked about Murray Bookchin and others. And so I think we don't need to necessarily think of the internet as automatically leading to this total information war and conspiracy running amok. Like, this infrastructure could support a different mode of organization, politically and economically, that could actually be, I think, far more ecologically regenerative and culturally healthy, right? It's just a matter of the incentive structures changing, because right now the whole of the internet runs on ads for profit, and to extract data from us to make the ads ever more effective and the algorithms ever more persuasive. That incentive structure is the problem, I think.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's like it's literally saying, let's call the chains of your imagination jewelry, and I hope you enjoy it. And could you spend more time doing it? Like, it's kind of nuts. Okay, so I want to ask a question that, I mean, people brought this topic up, but I want to ask one, and then Matt answer, and then Aaron ask follow-up questions, and I'll try not to jump in so we don't corner as team process. But
I love Kierkegaard. It's fine. We're all friends here.
Okay, then you can talk about Kierkegaard after this. But but here's why. There were a few other process people I had hoped had enough free time when I text them 3 weeks before I want them to send me a lecture, had said yes. And here's why. Almost nobody thinks the response to the fact that our political, economic, ecological situation in this nation state is effed up is a cosmological one. And that's what goes through my head. You put it on Front Street. And even though there are plenty of different philosophers, theologians, ethicists that say stuff that I agree with, Jörg Rieger got close. And that's because he's a liberation theologian and has a relational ontology. And it's implied, right, with with the democracy we dream of should be in all realms. And okay, I'm like, that's halfway there. But he's like, I'm definitely not a process theologian. And I'm like, when I read you, you are. But if you like, there's something that you and I, that goes through our imagination, that when you're like, how stuff is screwed up right now, democracy doesn't work for anybody and everyone hates shit, and we're going to destroy everything and things are going to hell. And then you're like, I know, that's why we need a new cosmology. And that does not make immediate sense to anybody, apparently, because they didn't write. They were like, oh, well, let's talk about this, or let's talk about this. So I want, I'll even put up a couple questions that are cosmology related, but this is the kinds of questions that came around it. But I just want you to talk about why Cosmology is a part of a response. And then I want Aaron to go tell us how he feels about it. And he can also bring in like why philosophers might have started somewhere else. So like Michelle said, what would a compelling 21st century cosmology look like that's scientifically compatible and spiritual uplifting? I think that's a really good question. If you wanted a collective to be motivated to cooperate and coordinate their actions and share deep values and celebrate the particularities of different traditions and have grandkids that breathe, I think that's a really good question to ask. Not a lot of people thought that was what they should put in their lecture. Andrew says, you reject both neoliberal capitalism and centralized communism. You want to know why? Because process people are uncomfortable with invisible hands functioning as authoritarians, seeking to accelerate the extractive economy and exploitation of the poor, and top-down power where the state pretends that if it is the ally to all. Yes, I agree. We should have a rejection of both, just like Matt did in his lecture. What would a process relational economic system look like? You hint at it. We have friends that have both written books on this. So there's a number of these kinds of questions, but all of them underneath of it, I think, kind of beg the question of why is a new cosmology part of an answer to how a particular country's cluster curse is happening? And in my head, it makes perfect sense. So I don't, it may not to Aaron. So I want you to try to convince him. And if you could say leap of faith at the end, it might help. I don't know.
Well, Thomas Berry was an important influence on me. He was a geologian, as people like to say. And, he says that if a cosmology really should just be and really is a functional ecology, which is to say how we live in a regenerative way on this, not just on this planet, but in the local bioregions that we find ourselves, because none of us really lives on the planet. Like, we live somewhere on the planet, and the needs and responsibilities of that locality are going to be different depending on where we are. And if we're going to have a functional ecological relationship to our place, it's because we're going to live in the context of a meaningful cosmological picture, world picture. There's no separation between our cultural meaning making activities and the minerals and plants and animals and ecosystems that we're embedded in, right? I'm not a reductionist. I don't think cultural meaning is reducible to how physicists describe, the standard model or whatever. But I do think, as Whitehead allows us to think, we're made ourselves of trillions of organisms. 90% of the organisms that like our bodies are made of are not even human, don't even contain human DNA. When we throw away a piece of plastic wrap or whatever, and think that it's out there in an environment separate from us, we're deluding ourselves, because in fact, the next glass of water we drink or meal that we consume is going to put that plastic right back into our bodies, right? These are cosmological issues. And so we navigate an ecological crisis, not just by understanding the science, but by understanding the new rituals, the new ritual forms that we would need to bring forth together and to enter into the right relationship with that world. Because it turns out that pre-modern people, animistic, ritual performing people, were correct, that it's the ritual practice that makes the sunrise, so to speak. It's our ritual performance of our of the sense of meaning that we believe the world has, and that comes from the role that we play in the midst of that world, that makes that world continue. And I think we have really dysfunctional rituals nowadays, like shopping is a good one. Sitting in traffic. We really love to sit in traffic. And on and
Check
on.
Our notifications.
Yeah.
Look how the stock market's doing. Look at our recent online sports gambling activities. Track our macros. Oh, geez, Matt disappeared.
Just lost him. Oh
Man,
my goodness.
We stopped prehending the signal from his.
I think it was probably your snarky examples of rituals. He just like, I'm out.
He hated.
He's like, I'm gone. Forget that.
That was the postmodern version of the Irish goodbye. He was like, talking, leave.
It has to go to space first, you know, as Louis C.K. would say. Our digital infrastructure has these hiccups once in a while. But yeah, you know, cosmology is important because it provides this background of meaning, which shapes our behavior, which is going to determine whether or not our civilization survives the century, you know?
Yeah. And so, that was like that bit. One of the things I like about Whitehead is when he's developing like the larger philosophical picture, he also wants there to be kind of a coherence between the account of the world and how an entity experiences a moment of becoming, right? So there's resonance between the cosmology and the phenomenological event. And I can't remember who was it. Oh, what's his name? No one cares which process interpretation of this. French guy. Jeez. Anyway, little cool book with the cool dark cover with the orange design on it. Talks about it. He also talks about nature, naturing. Oh. No, I can see the cover of it, but my entire library in the middle of my office now is covered with boxes from storage, so I can't walk over and just grab it, and it's really irritating me.
I would like to mention though that the mattress is gone.
I moved it because
our last live stream, there was a mattress behind him the entire time.
That's trashy.
Yes,
come on, Trev.
Just look.
there you go.
And I can see the book anyway. All right, Cosmology, Aaron.
Yeah, so I'm sort of torn on how even to start to respond, because I don't disagree with anything that Matt just said, right?
All right, but that's a perfect response.
Next question.
I don't disagree. However, I think this is probably really bad strategy. And I think maybe the best way to put it is like this. You are right that the stakes of our political flourishing are going to be infinitely deeper than any political philosophical analysis of them could offer, right? And thinking about this in terms of cosmology, and especially with a relational ontology that is trying to highlight the interconnected webs of relationships by which what we call meaning begins to emerge, I think all of that's entirely right. The worry I have is that story might be unbelievably compelling, and it might transform the world and get people united in action to change what we consider normal, right? And to, through deliberative democratic processes, overhaul our social structures in these positive, relational, compelling ways. I hope that's true. I also, though, think there are probably good reasons to think it's not, just at the level of what is likely to motivate behavior and action. And I tend to think that cosmological stories are most effective when we don't present them as cosmologies. That sounds, as somebody who lives an hour south of Asheville, that sounds like the kind of stuff people in Asheville that are driving Subarus say. And
well, we were picking who to hang out with.
I love Asheville. I ride bikes there weekly. I'm just suggesting it's not the kind of stuff that people in Greenville, South Carolina, where I live, say. And so I'm wondering, and God forgive me, I'm going to sound like Kevin Carnahan. I wonder if pragmatism is actually the better resource. So the answer has got to be an alternative cosmology. I would say an alternative ontology, right? A story about who we are and why it matters. But we could expand that out and say, yeah, but the cosmos gives us a more environmentally sexy way of saying that. Fine. That is the right level at which I think this has to happen. Pragmatically, I think the only way that actually transpires is to motivate local commitments that reveal that alternative rather than trying to argue for that alternative in order to motivate local commitments. And the reason I say it that way is the most hope I have had for our political context in years was right after the unbelievable and still unfolding tragedy of Hurricane Helene here in the upstate of South Carolina and the western North Carolina mountains. It was catastrophic for us. And there are communities that are still trying to claw their way back, right? I have friends who were without water for a month, without power for weeks. I mean, there's no way to describe what that was like. I was without it, I think 8-9 days, something like that. But the idea is what happened immediately on the heels of that unbelievable ecological catastrophe was the most impressive manifestation of social solidarity I have seen in my adult life. The only thing close, and I hesitate to even give this example, but the only thing I've seen close was the immediate response after 9/11, where everything fell away and it was like, look, our relationships are deeper than the crap that we normally let divide us, right? And in the face of climate catastrophe, in the face of flooding that has never been seen in this area before, in the face of human suffering and volunteers tragically pulling out bodies from rivers that they had kayaked 3 days before, what we saw were humans relating to each other as others. And in that otherness, with radical equality united by what I tend to call the human condition, though a process person might want to expand that out further, right? I think, again, pragmatically, we need to actually be more anthropocentric in order to motivate the kinds of behaviors and relationships and coalitions that allow for a broader relational model outside of human interests. And so in that moment, it took approximately 3 to 4 days before just enough kind of rumors and information and things started showing down. Yes, somebody says the COVID lockdown, another great example. What started happening was trickles of rumor and misinformation started showing up. And then Trump spreading lies about the lack of response and the FEMA money, and there's no... And then within about 2 weeks, the pockets where that stuff was taking root, things started breaking back down. But where that stuff was held at bay, it was, look, all I know is these people are helping us get back across this river that has destroyed our home. And that's all that matters. And so for me, I actually tend to think, yes, that is a cosmological or ontological or metaphysical shift away from radically egoistic libertarian individualism. Absolutely. But I tend to think strategic-wise, we should probably focus on, all right, what are the things that might genuinely motivate us to say, hey, I see you as somebody with whom I am connected, rather than trying to argue for the story of connection. That's my sort of pragmatic reply.
Yeah.
So do you think sometimes pragmatic gets used in this context by how we get people to vote so we have the power to do what is a good idea? Mm-hmm. Right. And so like if I was in charge of Democratic campaigns in the next election, I think I would tell everyone in the party, you cannot get on TV and not begin by saying, I think we should release the Epstein files. And it has nothing to do with what you think might be in it. It is the most pragmatic decision you could make.
Right.
And you're like, oh, I just think we should be honest. I agree with the vice president when he tweeted, or just, go through it. Like if you were just being pragmatic, but like, if you're asking like, what is the framework from which you begin to think about questions to change something, right? So that all the rain and flood, the consequences of that has a host of variables. Mm-hmm. Ongoing climate change, lack of investment in infrastructure, the decreasing of the budget, in both the Carolina states after they went into austerity mode when southern states stopped hiring Democrats to run the state but vote Republican abroad. Like there's a host of features, right? Like all of which require something. And underneath it is something where you go, when we're thinking maintenance, the things we're attending to are how do we get money in this area? How do we do this, X, Y, and Z? And not, right, like part of what Matt picks up in his lecture, a larger process vision, or something like Bruno Latour does in his Gifford lectures of like, oh, we actually need to think differently about our non-human neighbors, because when we haven't thought from the whole modern world, when we thought about our economic system that then shapes our political, religious, spiritual lives, none of the variables on there were the inputs, outputs on how it touched our non-human neighbors or impacted the environment and set up stuff, right? So if you were just sitting there aware of the facts, not trying to convince anyone to vote, you would want a cosmology that said, if the rise of sea levels, movement of precipitation, and average temperature only goes up 2 more degrees versus 6, the number of people that die is dramatically different, and my grandkids' life's better. Right? Like you could go, that is the most rational thing, and most people pragmatically are not going to talk about their cosmology. Right? And so you should just get up there and be like, thank you, Stephanie, for having me on CNN. We should release the Epstein files. What's your question? And because that's the pragmatic choice. But like sometimes philosophers use pragmatic, and I think what they mean is what gets the like slightly left of center person in their faculty room to vote for Bernie Sanders, not like pragmatic is, you know what I mean? Like there's a difference between pragmatic being pragmatism. And then it's like, what would Cornel West and Jeffrey Stout do if they got to decide? If you're thinking of like contemporary pragmatist philosopher, that's a different question.
That's right.
Does that make sense? Like,
it does. But all I mean by this,
making long-term plans, and you don't think about if you don't think cosmology matters, the entire modern world is here's what happens when you think all cultures that aren't Western should be Western. And all places that aren't included in the market should be, and that includes their people and their non-human compatriots.
Look, I get the objection, and again, I am not typically a pragmatist in either of those senses. First and foremost, right? I'm somebody who tends to favor impossible Derridian ideals and absolute hospitality as what constrains our behavior. You are not
the person I was worried of luring over.
So the reason I say this though is because I am genuinely wrestling with, especially over these 3 live streams that we've done this week, I am wrestling with what does it look like to be my own critic, right? And I would use different language. So the answer that I expect you probably thought I would give is, come on, Matt, the better answer is an existential cosmology, which we don't talk about cosmology. It's actually a relational ontology grounded in the face of the other. Levinas, woohoo! And believe me, that's my actual.
That's my 2/3 of the way to process.
And it jives well. I mean, there's a personalist dimension to my lecture as well, which would jive perfectly well with Levinas, and I bring in Buber explicitly, and so I think there's a way that we need to get to that level of interpersonal relations.
I'm going to stress the personalism and the existentialism of relational engagements, right? And argue that ethics goes all the way down, that the way we understand liberal ontology is fundamentally a non-starter for the kinds of visions we have of social flourishing. So again, when I say I don't disagree with what you said, I would just put it in different philosophical frame. But then I think, well, shoot, but does this work in the town hall in Charleston, South Carolina? Maybe. Columbia, South Carolina, less so. Roswell, Georgia. I mean, so I start thinking, well, what does it look like if we are genuinely committed to the moral implications of this relational personalism? I think it means that we somehow have to be strategic enough to recognize there are unreasonable citizens with whom engagement is just a non-starter. But we've also got to recognize millions of people with whom we disagree deeply are reasonable people, and their priorities are also typically motivated by the kinds of moral visions that we're trying to celebrate. It's just that they can't see that they are because of the framing that has been so deeply intrinsic to their worldview. And that's where I think, man, like when I used to travel around the country talking about evangelical shifts to environmental awareness and stewardship, I learned something really, really quick. The worst thing I can do to get predominantly white evangelicals to be motivated about environmental issues, the worst thing I can do was talk about the environment. The best thing I can do was talk about future generations and care for the young, right? And so I would pragmatically not, do whatever wins, right? Which is, I think, the kind of vulgar, just, strategic winning narratives trip that you're saying pragmatism can mean.
But it would be nice to release all the Epstein files.
It's more to say, what does it look like to take seriously the values already activated? Mm-hmm. And this is what sometimes legal theorists will talk about norm activation models, right? And so it turns out all those people that were in those churches saying environmentalism is this liberal nonsense, climate change is false, blah, 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 were deeply committed to obligations to future generations. Well, it turns out one of the best arguments for environmental stewardship is obligation to future generations, right? And so if I was willing to say, hey, I see you all are committed to something that I share as an important value commitment, let's talk about what that looks like. How do we care about this thing? And that's, I guess, my thought is one of my worries about process theological discourse, which maybe here's the point to say, I think it's just different than process metaphysics. Process metaphysics, I actually fully affirm as a challenge to a radically substantivist ontological story that does not admit of networks of hermeneutic exchange at the heart of the real. That's a super annoying way to say. I think radical individualism is bonkers as the model for meaning, right? So I'm a process metaphysician in
Hold on. All my process books just started clapping back there.
Tell them to hold on. The problem is when process metaphysics translates into process theology and then gets deployed as, hey, that crappy model of an authoritarian God, here's a better way forward. I tend to think that's where we've now introduced so much more than we need to. Important debates for sure, but all we need to say is, look, we are dependent beings. Fundamentally, we are interrelated with the lives of others. And we see this after Hurricane Helene, right? We see this at the beginning of COVID. We see this when we have real catastrophe. And that, I think, does the critical work to then say, people with whom I really disagree about social vision, help me make sense how your vision of this policy actually brings about the world that you think is good. And it turns out, I think that those arguments fall flat. And yet, I think that's where real engagement might begin to happen. So this is not actually a disagreement about process versus something else.
Okay.
It's a disagreement about strategy.
All right. I want to say something quick. Then there were questions that were personal versions of questions for both of you that will set up something fun, because I don't want to ask Matt to try to defend process theology. Because
I do have a few things to say. So
oh, you do? Okay.
Thing.
Well, then, okay. I'll just say this. One, I'm rather confident that as someone who can both act as a process philosopher or a process theologian, that pragmatically more people give a shit about the environment and the poor because I can articulate process theology in a compelling way to anyone that's touched the love of Jesus or the Holy Ghost. And I think I have, like, the actual number of people without a humanities degree that think God's not omnipotent, and that you should care about your non-Christian neighbor, your non-human neighbor, and the environment. More people think that, because of me and Tom Ward, than process philosophers that say prehension and concrescence and superject. And that's not like a flex. It's just a, I also want to say there are a whole lot of open theists who've won debates about omnipotence, and their congregations don't give a shit about the environment because they still try to play biblicist games and have eschatological exceptions and stuff. And I know because I've preached at their churches. And when those topics come up, the minister's awkward, even though they agree with me off the record.
This is debating,
so that's just
moment,
a pragmatic.
and I'm not gonna bite because I
want a whole episode arguing with you about this. The second is,
I would love to do that.
As a philosopher, I just want to ask the question: what's true? Like, truth really matters to me, and I've changed my mind as someone that has like 100-page single-space document where I change my mind on almost all theological and philosophical questions as I change it, and I track my changes, right? So, like, I like changing my mind, and when I was a process theologian before I thought Whitehead was right about a host of other stuff, till I was forced to learn science things that I didn't care about because I started as a post-structuralist. So like, I thought the process theology poetically was more compelling account of the Jesus story before I thought it was metaphysically true. And then I had to learn science because people thought I was a Phil student and knew it. And then I was like, actually, this is more true. So, like, sometimes I ask, like, well, if you're just asking what's the true question, which is unrelated to persuading a mass populace of X, Y, and Z for a political thing, I just think, like, the number of sentences that could be circled in all the lectures that are just metaphysically true for the reality everyone across the globe goes in, it goes up higher when a process philosopher's talking than someone that's worried about persuading their neighbor who's deep down a bigot and isn't changing. So, like, which is not a true about political philosophy. I'm just saying, like, if you have the gene, and I have it, and I'm very confident Matt has it, you, like, actually think about it. Do I have an internally consistent account that's as most true as I can do now? And I look forward to modifying it. That turns me on. My wife doesn't like listening when I change my mind all the time. And it's always on something like super niche. And she's like, I don't understand the moments of prehension. I don't care why you changed on this and this. And I was like, actually, I realized Marjorie was right about. Okay. And the last one is like if the process philosophy is the same as any philosophy, Neoplatonism, Aristotle, any of them, they all can get utilized in theological traditions across different things. So, like, process metaphysics gets used, and Matt and I can list off friends in every religion that exists, even ones I didn't know exist till I met a process theologian in it. And so, like, that process theologians that are Christian ask Christian questions, as someone that's written 2 books on how the hypostatic union's stupid and process helps. I'm very familiar. I don't think my other process philosopher friends are worried about that. Do they care that there are 3 sentences in process reality where the consequent nature of God should, if he's being serious, reinform how the primordial nature orients itself to the next moment of becoming, meaning that self-revelation could have a cumulative account, and then religious traditions have a narrative of self-revelation that's non-coercive, and you could have incarnation without divine invasion? No. But did it matter to Tripp? Yes. And is it internally consistent to the way he engages science and philosophy? And none of that ultimately changes if you explain that to someone, how we relate to the economy and philosophy. But if you come to articulate your faith tradition as a steward of it, think clergy and leaders and such, from a vision of it that includes something that coheres with it, then they'll hear about the incarnation or the resurrection or the kingdom of God and all those kinds of things. And the person that's helped them get to know their tradition has an internally consistent account that includes our non-human neighbors, recognizes the way we can resonate and participate and be mutually transformed by other religious traditions, value humanist tradition as an alternative form of introduction to value. There are all these kinds of ways where it benefits. And so, like, I think the process Christian theologians play a role in demonstrating and making vibrant, just like Rabbi Brad Artson does within the Jewish community, of making that metaphysical vision vibrant within a Jewish group. Or we could talk about our process Muslim friends or Jain friends or Buddhist friends. Any of them, when they give a tradition life in a particular vocality or tonality, but it coheres with a larger metaphysical account, which is asking truth questions and resonant questions across disciplines, then just participating in that tradition starts to make like the uniform of your tradition or your thing groove with a more ecological vision. And so, like, yeah, one part, the biggest part most people talk about, if you're Christians, is the problem of evil, given the prevalence of antichrist visions of deity with their Justinian editor to the tradition, which is Whitehead's joke about Caesar's editors ruining the Christian tradition by modifying all the doctrines so it sounds like God builds crosses rather than bears them, right? But like, that has an impact that's pragmatic, right? That's like why if I just only release the episodes of Homebrewed that are like philosophers and scientists that resonate with process, the 80,000 people that listen shrinks to 3,000. But all the people who listen to it, who are clergy and then have this vision, or people that find the process vision and then they start to describe their faith, faith energizes you so much that then you think in that way. And the natural question for a process person isn't like, oh, well, how did this investment work in your portfolio? It also asks, what are the energy sources that are going into it? How does it orient the way you relate to your neighbor and your non-human neighbor? All those things just naturally flow from the moment you realize omnipotence is an idolatrous doctrine that makes God not even as good as Jesus. Anyway, so that was my really short aside that turned into trip ranting. But I want to read the two personal questions to you, and then y'all can just talk. And I'll try not to say anything because I have one more beer that I'm going to drink before we end it. Okay. Oh, wait. No, Matt was going to say something.
Just briefly. I'll keep it brief.
Sorry, Matt. Sorry, Matt. I got excited.
I love when you get excited, Trip, honestly. I'm cheering for you over here. But to Aaron, I think that these visions that we each offered are actually mutually enhancing proposals. I totally agree that, yes, motivate local commitments that reveal the alternative. We need to start with where people are at and not come imposing this beautiful cosmology that they don't understand or that they don't have any connection to because it's just words they've never heard before or whatever. That's not effective, or it's just rude. I mean, I wouldn't want to do something like that. But I think there are ways to go into, say, a community that takes the Bible seriously and draw an environmentalism, so-called, out of the book of Job.
Absolutely.
Right? And just making it clear
Ask
that, like,
the beast.
Yeah, and just that, the natural world, it's not there to be subordinated to our human needs and utility, and it doesn't fit into our conceptions of morality, just the way that the weather works and earthquakes. It's like this nature, it rains when human beings don't need it to rain, right? And so I think you could speak to, there's so many resources within the Bible for an ecological vision and an ecological cosmology. So we don't need to come with a secular scientific view of what's true and impose it on. It's there already. And, I think Pope Francis did a marvelous job surfacing some of that for Catholics, but the encyclical was written not just for Catholics. It was written for everybody. I agree we need to be a little bit anthropocentric about how we approach this question. Human beings are important. I believe human beings have an important role to play on this planet, not just ecologically, but spiritually. I think environmentalism has really shot itself in the foot by being misanthropic and being anti-family, and really framing the challenge as one wherein we need to give up valuing human beings and human life so much. And like, oh, we're just a cancer on this. Like, no, that's not a motivating, inspiring vision. And I think it's spiritually false, profoundly so. But the mutual enhancement here, I think, is that as systems fall apart, political systems, economic systems fall apart, what you're pointing to that happened, in North Carolina there, the solidarity that emerges and the way that people take care of each other and all the other stuff falls away, at least for a time, until the fucking social media,
yeah.
And tears us apart again. And we get lost in the abstractions of the ideologies and forget that we're just here to take care of our neighbor.
Yeah.
That's a very good sign. And I think that's part of, the norms that guide people and the values that guide people that float to the surface and that we can trust, and that there's still humanity when disaster befalls communities. But and we're going to need that, because a lot of disasters are going to keep happening. But then how do we reconstruct a viable picture of the world and our place in it, whereby we can look into the future and, move towards a world where natural disasters are less frequent and less severe rather than more frequent and more severe. And it's a difficult thing. It's an ontological challenge, if you want to frame it that way. Like, Timothy Merton's idea of the hyper object. There's climate, which we have a very hard time wrapping our heads around. And there's weather, which we experience every day and talk to each other about very naturally. We need to sensitize ourselves to the difference of scale between weather and climate. And we can do it. We need art to do that, and we need religion to do that. Science, the graphs and the facts and the statistics, like, it gets us part of it. But we need art and religion to sensitize us to that difference of scale as well. And again, I think Job does a good job of that. And the other thing I wanted to say is just that if we don't explicitly engage the cosmological question, then it gets filled in for us by default by something called neoliberal capitalism. That is a cosmology. And most people don't really agree with it when they get down to it. But if we don't address the deep questions of the sources of value that motivate the deep motivational structure of our lives and how we interface with the natural, with the non-human world, then we allow the default cosmology of the market, of the capitalist market, to rule, right? So we can't just allow that to be the default. We have to raise these questions and challenge it.
Okay, I'm going to read these two questions and then y'all just talk, because we're supposed to wrap up soon. So Maddie asked this question to Aaron after the last live stream. She sent this one. Aaron mentioned he was charismatic. I'm a PK with baggage. How does he hold that identity without all the yuck? I want to say yes to a spirit that led me beyond most of my church. Brian sent this, and he mentioned it was a longer email to Matt, but like Matt's been on the podcast enough times that the last time he was on, he talked about kind of like rediscovering the Jesus-ishness of his identity in ways he holds it differently than before. And so Brian asked, I know Matt's talked about embracing a Jesus-ish identity in the last years. How did the Trumpist expression impact this desire to identify or shape how he relates to the larger faith? Right. So why I thought these both could set up something fun between you two is we're thinking about like religion, politics, relationship. Y'all share a lot of the same criticisms to both. And you're both professional philosophers that teach it day to day. And so, Maddie's question is like, Aaron, like, you managed to stay in this thing and whatnot, but I was a PK that came out of a charismatic thing. The spirit led me beyond it, how I do it. And then Brian, in his larger email, was just like, yeah, I had a multi-religious past or whatever and recently discovered Jesus. But in the larger version, he was like, I feel like I would be betraying Jesus if I called myself a Christian. Was one of the lines in the email. And
it's a great line.
You can see these cross pressures that are there, but both of you are philosophers, have a lot of the same values, and have negotiated it differently. And so I thought that would be a real helpful way of thinking, of y'all thinking together, and hopefully it will keep me from talking, because my question would just be like, Trip, you've been a Baptist and you're still a Baptist. You're just like you got more progressive and process, but you still think you should bring people to Jesus every day. And everyone that says the phrase bring people to Jesus is uncomfortable about what you mean by that. And everyone that likes what bringing Jesus means is uncomfortable with the fact that you use that phrase. That would, like that's how the question would go to me. It just wouldn't be interesting. So hopefully this sets up for you.
I'll defer to Matt. Start us off, man.
Right.
I'd love to hear your answer because it may impact how I articulate my own.
Well, I mean, I have an interesting mixed background. My father's Jewish, my mother's kind of evangelical, and I wasn't really raised steeped in a particular church. Though my mom talked a lot about the Bible and a lot about Jesus, and we would go to different churches, on occasion. But I rejected her Christianity and came to it later in my life, more on the basis of some potent, spiritual experiences, and to be Jesus-y in the age of Trump's and this resurgent Christian nationalism is interesting. I feel like there's I was returning to a new form of Christianity before it was cool, and I think it's become cool to be Christian again all of a sudden, whether it's in the MAGA context or not. I think there's a resurgence in interest in liberation theology, and that this it's becoming culturally avant-garde, to recover these traditions, and that wasn't the case 20 years ago when I became a little bit more Jesus-y. And but I'm uncomfortable calling myself Christian, but because I'm very interested in going back to that first century after Jesus and just looking at all the possibilities that were on the table for what this new thing could be. And I like the idea of letting it be a lot of things again, instead of thinking, and in the US, there's so many different congregations. And then, the more historical split with the Protestant and the Catholic thing. But if we go back to before Peter started the church, it's like there were a lot of options on the table. I've been really getting into Mary Magdalene and stuff. And that can get really new agey and whatever really fast. But there's legitimate textual evidence of an alternative, Marian feminine reading of the direction this tradition could have gone in. Mary's the first seer of the risen Christ, and I think in the Gospel of the Beloved Companion, which is it's dated to 50 CE, it's pretty early. What she says to Paul in the context of that text, what Mary says to Paul, that this is what Jesus said, and Paul's like, God wouldn't show a woman Christ first. You don't even count as a witness. Why are we listening to you? The way that sets a trajectory for how Christianity develops, I think, is really important for me to understand what can be recovered, and the way that this tradition can be understood as very much still at its beginning in terms of the cultural influence it can have, and that we don't need to allow it to have. We don't need to accept its capture by this legalistic form of really imperial idolatry, that Whitehead criticizes. There's this neat flip that I do in my lecture where it's Carl Schmitt points out the ways that our supposedly secular political categories are actually just, transpositions of theological ideas. Whitehead kind of inverts that and says, well, when Caesar's lawyers edited scripture, and when Rome sort of appropriated this new religious movement, the reverse happened, right? The political changed the theological. And I think we can, for me, it's just very powerful to imagine what Christ as a being and as a real spiritual being can do for people, and for publics, and for our culture and various cultures in this time. And whether we call it Christ, or we call it Logos, or we call it Buddha nature, I think the names that we use are less important than the spirit that comes over people that allows us to behave in ways that transcends our narrower interests and timescales and comfortable associations, and to really welcome the other, welcome the stranger, not just the strange human beings, but the strange non-human beings as well. into our sense of social solidarity. I think there's real potential here, and you know, it's been potent for me, but again, it's very, I'm kind of in the wilds here. I don't come out of a denominational context. I don't particularly often know how to reach people in those contexts, because I don't know what doctrines might offend them. I mean, I'm very naive in that whole domain, but I very much like connecting with people about the reality of this being who walked the earth and died and resurrected and has a powerful presence that I think can continue to shape what it means to be human. Connecting across whatever doctrinal differences about that possibility continues to be really an inspiration for me. Mm-hmm. That's my Jesus-y perspective.
All right, Maddie's really concerned now. I'm pretty sure the moment Matt mentions a non-canonical text, she's really worried. She's like, maybe my PK father was right. So she wants to say yes to the spirit that led her beyond the church that taught her about it.
Yeah. So I appreciate you sharing, Matt, some of your background. Mine is very different from yours, which I think is speaking to the idea that localities and embodied existential traditions are never disentangled from the broader stories that we try to tell about the real, right? Which I think is in some ways you and I agreeing about our earlier discussion. Like, we have to both have these broader metaphysical conceptions, these narratives of what we take to be true, to Tripp's point, and yet a deep awareness of what is strategically possible within the community in which you find yourself, right? And you being in the Bay Area and me being in, you know, the very red upstate of South Carolina changes some of even how we would speak about what we speak about.
Yeah.
Even if we're saying the same thing, right? And so I think the only thing that I would say, kind of preparing to give very concrete answers to Maddie's question, is the only thing that I would actually really take issue with that any of you have said in these unpacking of the processy part of tonight's discussion is I would love, Tripp, for us to do another episode where we actually talk about the kind of why I am open, why you are process, and why we think it matters. Because I do think the claims about rejecting omnipotence understood in very particular ways, I just think those are unnecessary to grant to get all the stuff that you're saying. And I think that there might be real challenges recovering some of the stuff that might get lost in that process, right? And I know you disagree with me, and so that's the only thing I would like pin.
I mean, it's rare to someone just like to be eager to have a podcast where I know I win. So
I look forward to being refuted, my friend. So why I say that though is it's actually a kind of preface to what does it mean for me to still identify as Pentecostal. So my very quick, just because you gave a little bit of your background, Matt, my background is I am fourth generation Pentecostal. My uncle was one of the very first Pentecostal ministers behind the Iron Curtain, was a big evangelist. My grandfather was a Pentecostal preacher in Ohio. I've had both of my parents were professors at Pentecostal Church of God institution, Lee universities, where I went to school. So I was, you know, as we say, teethed on the Redback hymnal and then learned to play drums in altar calls, right? And so denominational specificity was for me the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee. But more important than that denominational affiliation was this sense of pneumatology as the frame by which our Christology makes sense. And so that was deeper in me than I could articulate, right? That was true for me before I had any of those sexyology words available in my vocabulary. And ironically, the reason I still identify as Pentecostal is because I had to abandon my identity as evangelical when Trump got elected the first time, because I no longer pragmatically saw that word doing the critical work I wanted it to do, tapping into David Bebbington's kind of fourfold model of evangelical history. That just wasn't what it meant. It meant you are a Trump supporting person 81% of the time. And I was like, yeah, this just doesn't work for me anymore. And so, and to be honest, the conversionism was starting to become sketchy, right? That's the one spot where I do kind of break with traditional evangelical theology. But Pentecostal, no one knew what that meant. that was still sexy. They think I play with snakes, right? Like, so there was actually this kind of strategic way to deploy that identity, since it was generationally deep in how I make sense of myself. And that has gotten complicated by Paula White and Joel Osteen and John Gray and all this crowd, right? I am, as of right now, still clinging to the word as one that I'm trying to defend as not being allowed to become what those folks are. I may realize this is a lost battle and have to find a different word. But to Maddie and others who are interested, I'm going to give 4 reasons. If I had longer to think about it, there might be 17. But I've got 4 reasons why I still identify as Pentecostal. And they are: 1, because Pentecostalism stresses what I would describe as embodied affect as crucial to a lived piety. This is the emotivism. This is the more charismatic worship. This is the idea that things like glossolalia, which is not something I've ever personally engaged in, but is something I affirm as theologically veridical. All of that is just a way of understanding embodied affect. We feel before we think, as my buddy James Smith says, right? 2, lived experience is the primary mode of meaning making. So it's very hard to make meaning if you are not living into, you talked about rituals earlier. I've been doing a lot of reading by Paul Woodruff, where he talks about the reverent ceremony being necessary for democracy to be restored. And he says we've got to avoid mere ritual, where we're just going through the motions. And he says reverent ceremonies are where we participate in the life of a community and we learn virtue by being virtuous. And so for me, this lived experiential dimension of Pentecostal worship is something I take really, really seriously. 3rd, Pentecostalism is deeply, deeply socially democratic. And what I mean by that is it has, I think, the most robust notion of a priesthood of all believers, of the relevant alternatives that I would take seriously. It models the idea that your position, your station, your education, your background, your race, class, none of these things matter for God's radical engagement with your lived experience, and then the possibility of participating in the life of the divine within your community, right? The hierarchy is not there in Pentecostal ecclesiology, even though it is often there in Pentecostal churches, where you've got the CEO who just controls cult-like in their society. I think that's actually a failure of Pentecostal theology, not a performance of it. And then finally, Pentecostalism is radically personalist in ways that I am unrelentingly committed to. Like, of any of these ideas, that's the one that I will, like, for me, Christianity hinges on this. And for what it's worth, Trip, this is where I disagree with Process. I think Process allows us to become impersonalist if we're not careful. I don't think all Process people are, but I think it flirts with that. And for me, if we're flirting with that, we have now eliminated the very reason to take seriously theological discourse in the first place. So all of that said a little bit more performatively, the first time Trip and I ever were on stage together, and we have been on stage many times since then, he was probably already drunk. I'm fairly sure that Tony Jones, who was also there, was not drunk, but was just crotchety that night, which is probably...
Lauren Winter, though, brought a bottle of bourbon to the pre-show gathering. So
maybe y'all were already...
a variable that you just...
y'all were deep in, right? And I didn't know what I was getting into, because I had Tripp, who I had met sort of in passing, and he called me. He's like, hey, man, I need you to come up to Asheville. We're doing this thing. I'm going to put you on stage, be part of this live show. Come on. And I was like, all right, cool. And so I show up, and one of the first questions in this bizarre sing along, there's beer around the walls, everybody yelling.
It's like 400 youth ministers.
Yeah, it was a strange space, not my normal audience. And at the time, I was doing no public intellectual work. So like I was a hardcore continental philosopher being invited to come speak and interview at this audience. And Tripp looks at me and says, so yeah, explain speaking in tongues. And then Tony Jones like just continues to keep hitting this. He's like, yeah, what is that crap? Like, and both of y'all were really ganging up on this stuff is bizarre. And I will actually, as a way of illustrating embodied affect, live experience, socially democratic and radically personal, my answer then was the following, and this is why I still claim, Maddie, to be Pentecostal. If God, if the divine is personal in the way that the vast majority of the Christian tradition claims, I don't know what it would look like to encounter the divine presence and be in contemplative control of one's bodily behavior. And my example here is I've seen too many people meet Beyonce and not be able to control themselves at all. Or my wife, for what it's worth, we once went to an Edwin McCain concert and she got to meet Edwin afterwards.
Oh, I love Edwin McCain.
My wife was losing her crap, right? And so the idea that when we meet divinities, in this case, just popular big social stars, our body betrays us. And the idea that we would encounter God and our body just be like, hey, Jesus, what's up, right? I think it probably would look more like people laughing uncontrollably, maybe just setting off running because they're so stoked. Maybe they would, in fact, try to say something and it would come out gibberish. All of that, yeah, we've lost him now too, right? All of that, though, I think is speaking to the idea that the phenomenology of human experience when it encounters stuff that is beyond its cognitive grasp tends to play out as embodied responses. And I think Pentecostal pneumatology, whether sophisticated or very lowbrow, gets right the phenomenology of divine encounter. And I've never spoken in tongues, but, you know, shoot, if I was walking down the street and like ran into Questlove, I'm pretty sure I'd not be like, sup? Like, dude, yeah. I love that beat you did on Right Seed. And that very fact makes me think, man, if I also encountered God as personally invested in my lived experience, I'm pretty sure that would cause me to get a little bit more excited than what I see in most mainline churches. And that's not a critique of them.
It's also not hard.
I mean, my point is like, I think, again, 1,000 flowers bloom, right? There are other modes of embodied expression of worship. But for me, I love Bon Iver. I cannot imagine having to listen to him for the rest of my life. I think I would put my head through a wall. And I want a Norma Jean show to break up the Bon Iver tracks. And Pentecostalism to me is simply the theology that says, look, heaven's probably got a mosh pit. And I think that's pretty badass.
Oh my. I'm glad y'all both answered that question. And here's a fun one. Do you think the difference between your answers has more to do with one of you coming from the Bay Area and the other from South Carolina, or anything you ever learned in any class?
What do you think, Matt?
Well, I mean, I didn't grow up in the South. I grew up below the South in South Florida, which is
it's its own thing.
But
what part? I went to high school in Tampa.
Hollywood. So
Hollywood. Oh, way south. Yeah.
Fort Lauderdale, Miami. Yeah.
Way south.
So I'm not born and raised in San Francisco or anything like that. Though obviously it's shaped me over the last nearly 2 decades. I have a lot of criticisms of the more new agey kind of spirituality that was born here in many ways. And but I'm quite influenced also by the Episcopal Bishop of California, Mark Andrus, who was in doctoral studies with me at CIS. And, I think I am someone who came to Christianity in a very, I should say, who came to Christ in a very unorthodox way, you know. And I think that I'm noticing among people I hang out with here in the Bay that that's happening more and more often.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting phenomenon that I think might become increasingly important as we think about the future of responses to this revelation. You know,
Dude,
so.
okay, people should just go back and listen to Matt and I's longer conversation about his hangout with Jesus. But I got an email that was like, I'm coming to theology beer camp. I've been a Christian for like the last 9 months, but I've always wanted to walk the aisle. Could you invite people to walk the aisle at theology beer camp? Because now we're on talking terms. And I did not know what to do with an email that is both like, I grew up atheist, I kind of got more spiritual, had a psychedelic trip where I talked to Jesus while listening to your podcast. And I kind of want to have a come to Jesus moment where I walk down an aisle in a group of people, but I can't go to a normal church and be like, the shrooms taught me about Jesus. So if you could ask people to walk the aisle at Theology Beer Camp, I'll come down and then maybe I'll lay hands on me. And I was just like,
Wow.
you have no idea how many people with baggage that you have no idea what it'd be like to have would be triggered in the room if I was like with all eyes closed and heads bowed. And but I say that just because I know, like, there are some people like Maddie's experience, like, how can I hold on to this beautiful thing I was gifted in a Jesus tradition, and others who are like, dude, I didn't discover Jesus. This is cool AF. He has horrible PR. I don't know. Right. And that cross current exists. And one of the benefits of both of you is y'all have been in multiple situations, worked across different disciplines, right? And in your head, like, I can't remember who mentioned earlier, like, well, if I translate this to this, I do this to this. But when the moment we think about religion, politics in this country, there's a whole chunk of the country that's never had to translate anything to anything.
Yeah.
And then there are others that are like, I hated having to translate it to this other thing. And then there are a smaller, more elect group who are like, isn't it cool that I have a metaphysical system that 0.01% of humanity knows anything about? But in that 0.01%, I have friends on 7 different major religious traditions and 13 minor ones and 4 new religious movements. And we have more in common about our ecological web of belonging than, like, you know, so like whatever that is, that their 2 questions provoke stories about but your own journeys and then these different things, I think really sets up to, like, when we think about any particular faith in this particular context, is a good, like, everyone's a multitude with a multiplicity of stories running in it. And so in some sense, it's not like the kind of authoritarian desire to have the final story, but more of like a nutrient desire to have the most beautiful version of all the stories that make us up and make our neighbors up and our larger communities up. And that feature, I think, is a thread that runs across a host of the different lectures, even though they all didn't talk about cosmology, like, you know.
Well, and I would say to Maddie, in my attempt to defend, you know, my Pentecostal identity as something that is still intellectually and maybe theologically robust, look, church is really hard for me. So I don't know if this is true for you, Matt, but like my hunch would be that somebody who has a more unorthodox model of background, who has a more synchronous conception of how these things might play together, which again, I find all wonderful. The Bay Area probably offers a range of different communities with whom you might make common cause.
Yeah. If you don't think in South Carolina that he's going to have as a PhD student the Episcopal bishop?
I'm suggesting that in South Carolina, in Tennessee, in Kentucky, right? States I care deeply about, because I'm also deeply Southern in my identity. My truck is lifted, as I think all trucks should be. But like, I mean, that's a whole cosmology all its own, Matt, for a different episode. But I just can't imagine in the South the idea of if you are more progressive politically, right, whether or not theologically, if you're more progressive politically, the range of churches that are going to be viable options is already very limited.
Mm-hmm.
And they are almost always very denominationally specific in ways that make things like Maddie's point really hard, right? So if you come from a more charismatic background and you're looking for a affirming church that's more inclusive, but also has, you know, a more emotive commitment to what it looks like to have praise and worship as really important parts, and homilies are not just 7 minutes long, but they might go a while, and, you know, like those churches, like I keep asking on every podcast we do, Trip, like if they exist, please somebody tell me where they are in the South. I will try to drive and go to them. But instead, what you've got is like the big Cooperative Baptist Fellowship Church here in town, which is amazing and has an amazing pastor who I respect and love. The problem is the church is so far from what the embodied affect and Liz experiential background that I bring to the table that it becomes impossible for me.
Yeah.
But yet then I go to my Pentecostal churches. I attend an Assemblies of God church here in town, and I love my pastor and he's wonderful, and the staff I respect. The problem is, as a community, it still is very, very, very much anchored in a whole bunch of stuff that I find horrifying. And I feel like I need to deprogram my son when he comes home from youth group, right? And it's like, gosh, church shouldn't be like that's not healthy. So part of what I would say to Maddie is, I, in solidarity with their struggle, believe me, going to church is not a thing that I find easy in order to maintain my Pentecostal background. It would be easy if I just became Anglican, or if I just became Episcopal, or if I just jumped all in and was PCUSA. There's lots of those options available in the South, and they're wonderful and life-giving. The problem is, for my family's background, like, you know, the first week my wife is like, this is amazing and how beautiful and wonderful, and I can hear everybody singing. Week 3, she's like, why are we taking communion again? We just did this, right? So like, it just,
yeah.
So
if you ask
I,
that question
you know,
after the 3rd week, it's really hard to be mainline Protestant.
really hard.
Like,
so I just want to make
you're
sure
supposed
Maddie
to
knows
ask
that. Right?
why are they still preaching? When are we doing the Eucharist? You're supposed to ask that.
Yeah, that's gonna be tough for us.
Dude,
My son, in fact,
I understand.
he was
I
like,
couldn't get a job being a Baptist, so I had to cosplay a mainline Protestant. And
well, and
you only do half your sermon each Sunday.
I mean, I just want to make sure that Maddie and anyone knows, like, what I'm defending is not some sort of like idealistic, isn't this lovely? It's a deep lived struggle that I navigate daily. And to be honest, I genuinely am not sure how this is going to play out, right? Because I take so seriously wanting my son to not be a Christian nationalist, to not grow up thinking that God is authoritarian, not to grow up with a strong conception of determinism anchored in his notion of the divine.
He needs a process youth minister. It sounds like.
And then I find those youth ministers and I think, oh, how cool. We can hang out and be friends with each other. And then I go to their churches and my son's like, where are the drums?
Yeah,
and I know that
are as bored as your kid.
See, I know that is banal, right? And so, like, in some ways, Matt, I respect so deeply
aesthetics
what
is
you're
the
saying.
real question.
It's not trivial, and so, Maddie, if you live anywhere near Greenville, South Carolina, and you find the church that lets us hang out at process parties with critics like me, and yet we also can hang out with like Kirk Franklin and Tasha Cobbs Leonard music at the beginning of the homily, please let me know, because I will drive and come to that church.
There you go. Well, thank you both for, Aaron for doing a lot of stuff to help set this whole thing up, and Matt joining when we had a sick person. They weren't sick, their kid was sick, and responding to a text message.
They'll be sick soon enough if that's the case. So.
Yeah, it's how it's
just
works.
a matter of time.
Sharing is caring. But this has been a lot of fun. And remember, everyone who's been on the stream, which is exciting. They're like, we got 300 and some people still on, and we're over 2 hours. So that's pretty cool. If you want to go and haven't signed up to get all the lectures, including Matt's, with a plenty of cosmological excitement. Head over to homebrewclasses.com. You can grab those, send any questions in response to the emails, and then we'll include them in follow-up emails with all the people that did the lectures. And yeah. And Lori left another comment, who has been in all 3 live streams I did today.
So impressive. Oh my goodness.
I don't know if she smoked more cigars than I did today, which was quite possible because I know we have a shared love of tobacco. But having just finished my 7th hour of live streaming today, I'm very much looking forward to the next beer where I'm not worried about having to pee my pants. or
be articulate in a response. There you go.
I'm looking forward to whatever our follow-up conversation is going to be. That's not
just a
related to
reminder.
the summit.
Well, just a reminder
philosophy
to everybody that is listening. Get your questions submitted, because again, the summit, though this week has kind of been the inaugural kickoff and these live streams and all this and the guests, we are going to be doing follow-up interviews that are a little bit more intentional and formal, where what we're doing is saying, hey, these are the questions coming in from the audience, and really trying to make sure that all of these lectures lead to conversational engagement with you all watching and engaging with them. Also, the Facebook group, get signed up for that, the Democracy Intention Facebook. That's where, again, Trip and I are hanging out and responding to questions and thoughts. And that's been always really fun in classes we've done in the past. And Matt, before we let you go, because I know you're also tired coming back from Europe, what would you tell people that want to, find more out about you? Like, where can they connect with you, or what book of yours just came out that they need to go pick up?
Yeah, well, thanks, Aaron. If footnotes to Plato, enter that into Google or Perplexity or ChatGPT or whatever you're using these days to find your information on the internet, and you'll find my stuff. You guys, this has been a real pleasure. Really enjoyed meeting you, Aaron, being in dialogue with you. I think very generative agonism, but also I think really, again, mutually enhancing proposals that were thrown on the table. And Trip, always good to see you. Always happy to fill in late if somebody cancels. You know where to find me. Glad we could do this. It was a nice surprise.
Oh, so yeah. No, I was worried you weren't going to be awake. And then I was like, he's still out of Europe, because I was like, oh, I'll ask him to record something when we get back. But I'll just tell you, Matt, there are some really fun questions that got sent in. Like, what role would spirituality play in a democratic deliberation without violating? What role should spirituality play without violating secular norm and recognizing the dignity of non-human neighbors? There's that question. Matt calls for a new natural theology. What brings world religions together for ecological care? How do we navigate genuine theological differences across traditions with a shared natural orientation towards theology? Like, there's a host of questions. Like, I loved his use of the concept of earthling or Gaia as a primary deity. It also creeped me out. How do we make a transition into those concepts without falling into an eco-authoritarianism, or is that a concern he has? What are the practical implications of giving political agency to non-human nature? I don't even know what that means, though I think it's a good idea to do it. Like, there, some of the more
clearly there is a follow-up conversation yet to be had, where we dig into some of that,
because people have been sending really cool questions, and then Aaron and I are looking, whoever's on the live stream, at 40 questions or so people sent, and go, which ones do you not have to have already watched the lecture to make you want to go watch it, but also not go like too deep cut? But since multiple people mentioned Schmitt, I thought, that'd be fun to start with.
We can dig.
Who knows?
And we've also done. Trip and I did a like political thinkers episode early this spring that kind of inaugurated some of this. And Schmitt was somebody we talked about in light of Chantal Mouffe and Rob Fleece and others. So I thought your lecture was fantastic in helping us bring together some of these threads that we've been pulling on for several months. And it resonated, I think, with some really cool other lectures as well. So thanks, Matt, so much for being with us. To anybody that, again, is unfamiliar with my work, which is probably most of you, check out jaronsimmons.com or go on over to my Substack, which is Philosophy in the Wild. And we will hang out and do philosophy together there. And every Monday, for paid subscribers, I do Music Mondays, where we talk about all the kind of stuff that I want to tempt Trip into for every one of these. It's like, all right, fine. Tell me about process theology and the Fugees. So if you want to hang out with that, that's
okay.
over
I could do
Philosophy of the
Fugees because I was, that was one of my BMG music free CDs.
There you go. So thanks everybody so much for joining this trip. As always, it's a joy, man. And hope everybody gets some rest.
All righty. Peace out, friends.